I thought the shadows were my only company.
I walked into the private hall stripped of my pride and my clothes, desperate to wash away the scent of a life I never chose. But the man waiting there, the one whose name is whispered like a death sentence, didn't turn away. Kang Jae-Min had sworn a blood oath to keep his distance, yet in that frozen moment, his eyes told a story of a 5-year hunger that honor could no longer starve. We were two empires colliding in the silence of a marble corridor, and neither of us would emerge unscathed. Welcome to the vault. I'm your narrator, and we're about to witness the moment a silent obsession turns into a loud, dangerous war. Our story begins now. The silk of my spare gown felt like a second skin, but it was the heavy, tailored wool of Jae-Min's jacket draped over my shoulders that truly anchored me to the earth. It was a dark, obsidian weight, smelling of expensive sandalwood, and the sharp, metallic tang of the rain that had begun to lash against the spa's high windows. As I walked back toward the ballroom, every step felt like a betrayal of the carefully constructed wall I had built around my heart for 5 years. The fabric was still warm from his body, a ghost of his heat seeping through my thin straps, making my skin prickle with a terrifying awareness. I reached the service entrance, pausing as the muffled roar of the gala, the clinking of crystal, the vapid laughter, the predatory drone of business deals, threatened to trigger the panic I had only just managed to submerge. I clutched the lapels of his jacket, my knuckles white against the dark fabric. He had seen me. Not the glass princess of the Vale family, but the trembling woman beneath the titles. He had raised his eyes and shattered the non-aggression pact with a single, searing look that felt more intimate than any touch. Aria. The voice wasn't Jae-Min's. It was thin, reeking of unearned confidence. I turned to see Luca Ferrara leaning against the mahogany doorframe, his tuxedo rumpled, and his eyes glassed over with too much scotch. "Your father has been looking for you," Luca said, his gaze traveling over me with a possessiveness that made my stomach churn. Then his eyes snagged on the jacket. The silhouette was unmistakable, the cut was too sharp, the quality too high for any common security detail. "That's not yours." I was cold, I managed, my voice steady despite the hammer of my pulse against my ribs. "You look like you're wearing a shroud," he sneered, stepping closer, his hand reaching out to tug at the collar. Before his fingers could graze the wool, a shadow eclipsed the light from the hallway. Kang Jae-Min moved with a silent, predatory grace that seemed to still the very air in the corridor. He didn't speak immediately. He simply stood behind me, his presence a towering wall of obsidian that dwarfed Luca's petty malice. "The lady said she was cold, Ferrara," Jae-Min said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through my back. Luca froze, his hand dropping as if burned. The power imbalance was staggering. The Korean Don didn't need to raise his voice to command the space. He looked at Luca as if he were an insect, then shifted that dark, heavy gaze to me. In the dim light of the service wing, the restraint he had practiced for 5 years seemed to be fraying at the edges. "Go back to the ballroom, Luca," Jae-Min commanded, not looking away from me. "The Vales and the Rosses are discussing the shipping routes. You wouldn't want to be late for your own funeral, would you?" Luca paled, muttered a curse, and retreated into the noise of the party. We were alone again, the silence stretching between us like a wire pulled to the breaking point. I should have handed him the jacket. I should have thanked him and run back to the safety of my father's shadow. But the weight on my shoulders felt like a claim, a silent promise of protection that my own blood had never offered. "You're shaking, Aria," Jae-Min murmured, stepping into my personal space until the tips of his polished shoes touched the hem of my dress. "It's the cold," I lied, though the hallway was stifling. He reached out, his thumb brushing the line of my jaw just once, a touch that violated every treaty, every blood oath, and every lie I had ever told myself. "It's not the cold. It's the realization that I'm not going to let him have you." The longing in his eyes was a reflection of my own, a dangerous, electric truth that threatened to burn the city to the ground. I realized then that I wasn't wearing a jacket. I was wearing a declaration of war. The heavy double doors of the ballroom swung open, swallowing me back into a sea of artificial light and the suffocating perfume of the elite. I moved like a ghost through the crowd, still draped in Jae-Min's obsidian jacket, feeling the eyes of every family associate burn into the dark wool. The string quartet played something hauntingly upbeat, a sharp contrast to the Cold War simmering beneath the floorboards. My father stood at the center of the room, his laughter sounding like a death knell as he toasted to my impending merger with Luca Ferrara. I kept my chin high, the mask of glass firmly in place, even as the secret of what had happened in the corridor pulsed like a second heartbeat against my ribs. I found a corner near the velvet-draped pillars, clutching a glass of champagne I didn't intend to drink. Across the room, near the marble bar, Jae-Min was already being circled by the vultures of the syndicate. Valentina Russo hovered at his elbow, her laughter a melodic intrusion, her hand resting with practiced ease on his forearm. I felt a sharp, hot twist of jealousy, an emotion I had no right to feel, yet one that scorched me more than the steam of the spa ever could. Then, as if sensing the weight of my stare, Jae-Min raised his head. Our eyes met across 30 feet of polished stone and 100 dangerous people. In that single, electric moment, the ballroom vanished. His gaze didn't hold the practiced neutrality of a dawn. It held the raw, dark intensity of the man who had seen me exposed and decided he would never look away again. It was a silent conversation, a confession of 5 years of longing hidden behind the pretense of appropriate professional contexts. I saw the way his jaw tightened as he watched my father approach me, his hand landing heavy on my shoulder. "There she is," my father boomed, his eyes cold and calculating. "The jewel of the Vale family. Aria, tell the gentleman how much you're looking forward to the union." I felt the air leave my lungs, the same oxygen-deprived panic from the pool room threatening to return. I looked back at Jae-Min, my silent plea cutting through the noise. He shifted slightly, his broad shoulders tensing as he broke away from Valentina's touch with a dismissive grace that spoke volumes. He didn't come to me. That would be a declaration of war. But he stood his ground, his eyes promising a protection that the blood oath between our families had specifically forbidden. The secret between us felt like a live wire, humming with the knowledge that he had broken his word the moment he looked at me. If my father saw the way Jae-Min's shadow seemed to stretch toward me, if he smelled the sandalwood of the Rossi dawn on his own daughter's skin, the peace treaty would burn to ash before the night was over. "I am doing what is best for the family, father," I said, the lie tasting like copper in my mouth. I caught Jae-Min's slight tilt of the head, a gesture only I could interpret. "Buy yourself space," his eyes seemed to say, echoing the words he'd whispered in the shadows. "Don't agree to anything you're not ready for." For the first time in my life, I wasn't alone in the circus. I was a partner in a dangerous game, tethered to the one man who saw my soul beneath the designer gown. The champagne in my glass had gone flat, but the air in the ballroom was carbonated with a new, jagged tension. Luca Ferrara returned from his retreat, his ego bruised and seeking a target to re-establish the hierarchy he thought he owned. He didn't approach me with the clumsy gait of a drunk this time. He moved with the calculated swagger of a man who knew he had the backing of my father's signature. He stepped into my space, his hand snaking around my waist with a possessive grip that felt like a shackle, pulling me flush against his side in a display for the surrounding dawns. "You've been wandering, Aria," Luca murmured, his voice loud enough to carry to the nearby circles. He leaned in, his breath hot against my ear, while his eyes darted toward the bar where Jae-Min stood. "And you're still wearing that ridiculous jacket. It doesn't suit a Ferrara bride." I felt the eyes of the room shift. In the Mafia world, every gesture is a message, and Luca was broadcasting a claim. I tried to pull away, but his fingers dug into my hip, a silent warning that I was property, not a person. My gaze involuntarily flickered to Jae-Min. He was perfectly still, a statue of obsidian and restrained violence. I saw the way his glass nearly shattered in his hand, his knuckles turning a ghostly white. The protected status that had kept us apart for 5 years was now a cage of his own making. He was bound by a blood oath to stay away, yet the sight of Luca's hand on my skin was clearly a match dropped into a powder keg of long-standing obsession. "The jacket stays," I whispered, my voice trembling with a mix of defiance and the residual fear of my earlier panic attack. Luca's expression darkened, his mouth twisting into a sneer. Is that so? I think it's time we return the Rossi Don's property. It's unseemly for you to be wrapped in another man's scent on our engagement night. He reached for the lapel, his intention clear. He was going to strip the protection from my shoulders in front of everyone. I saw the shift in Jae-Min before I heard it. He didn't run. He glided across the floor, the crowd parting like a black sea. He reached us just as Luca's fingers brushed the wool. Jae-Min's hand caught Luca's wrist in a grip that looked effortless, but made the younger man gasp in pain. The music seemed to fade, the ballroom falling into a lethal, expectant silence. "The lady said she was cold, Ferrara," Jae-Min said, his voice dropping to a register that made my skin prickle with a terrifying awareness. It wasn't just a correction, it was a promise of violence. "I don't recall asking you to touch my things, or her." The her hung in the air, a blatant violation of the non-aggression pact that specifically excluded him from crossing certain lines with me. By acknowledging me as something he had an opinion over, he was declaring that his restraint was failing. "She's a Vale," Luca hissed, trying to pull his arm back. "And she's going to be a Ferrara. You have no say here, Rossi. Remember the pact." Jae-Min stepped closer, his shadow completely eclipsing both of us. He looked down at Luca with eyes so dark they looked black in the low lighting. "The pact protects her from my touch, Luca. It does not protect you from my wrath if you don't take your hand off her immediately." The romantic tension was so thick it felt like a physical weight, a suffocating heat that had nothing to do with the gala and everything to do with the way Jae-Min was looking at me, not as a business asset, but as something he had wanted for 5 long years. I felt the shift in the room's power. The alliance was fracturing, and I was the fault line. The tension in the ballroom was a live wire, humming so loudly I feared it would shatter the crystal chandeliers. My father moved in to de-escalate the public rupture, his voice a low, warning hiss to Luca, but Jae-Min didn't wait for an invitation to leave. He caught my elbow, his first intentional touch, a brief, searing contact that felt like a brand, and guided me toward the high glass doors leading to the west balcony. We stepped into the biting night air, the heavy obsidian jacket still anchored to my shoulders, a dark shroud that smelled of the man now looming over me. The balcony was a secluded island of marble and shadows, far above the glittering predatory circus of the gala. For a long moment, Jae-Min didn't speak. He simply stared out at the city's skyline, his jaw set in a line of iron. The restraint that had defined him for years seemed to be vibrating out of him, a physical force that made the air between us feel thick and difficult to breathe. "You should go back inside," he said finally, his voice rougher than I had ever heard it. "Before your father realizes that I'm not just breaking the pact, I'm incinerating it." "Why did you do it?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper against the wind. "You've spent 5 years looking through me as if I were made of glass. You've been the perfect Don, the man of his word. Why break it now?" Jae-Min turned, the movement so sudden I gasped. He stepped into my space, his shadow swallowing me whole, trapping me between the cold stone railing and the heat of his body. He reached out, not to touch me, but to grip the railing on either side of my waist, caging me in. "You think I looked through you?" He laughed, a dark, humorless sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "I have spent 1,826 days pretending I didn't see the way you tilt your head when you're bored, or how you bite your lip when you're trying to hide your fear from your father. I've watched you since the night of your 18th birthday, Aria. You wore a dress the color of a bruised plum, and you laughed at something your brother said, and the whole world went gray for me except for you." The confession hit me like a physical blow, more devastating than the panic attack that had driven me to the spa. 5 years, I breathed, my heart hammering against the ribs he had just admitted to watching so closely. 5 years of silence, he corrected, his dark eyes searching mine with a predatory longing. "Every time I saw you at these events, every time I had to sit across from your father and discuss treaties that kept me from you, it was a war. The distance wasn't indifference, Aria. It was the only thing keeping me from burning this entire city to the ground just to keep you. I swore an oath to protect you, but tonight I realized I can't protect you from a life with Luca. If I'm standing on the other side of a line I drew myself." He leaned in closer until the scent of his sandalwood cologne was all I knew. "I'm not a good man. I'm the monster they whisper about, but I'm the monster who has loved you from the dark for half a decade. And if you decide you want this, if you decide you want me, there is no going back to the safety of your father's rules." The choice hung between us, electric and impossible to ignore. I looked at the man who had been my silent guardian and my most forbidden desire, realizing that the protected girl was gone, replaced by a woman who was finally ready to be seen. The night air was a sharp blade against my heated skin, but it was the proximity of Jae-Min that truly made me ache. He remained a silhouette of lethal restraint, his hands still gripping the marble railing on either side of me, caging me within the circle of his scent and the terrifying truth of his confession. For 5 years, I had lived as a ghost in my own life, invisible even to myself. Yet here was the one man I was forbidden to crave, admitting he had catalogued every heartbeat I'd ever wasted on silence. I looked up at him, the obsidian jacket still heavy on my shoulders, a physical manifestation of the claim he had already laid upon my soul. The wind whipped a stray lock of hair across my face, and for a heartbeat, the mask of the glass princess finally shattered. I didn't want the safety of the treaty. I didn't want the protection of a father who viewed me as a business merger. I wanted the danger that lived in the dark depths of Jae-Min's eyes. "Then touch me," I whispered, the words a reckless spark in the dark. Jae-Min flinched as if I'd struck him. His jaw tightened, the muscle leaping under his skin, and I saw the sheer agony of his self-control. "Aria, think about what you're asking. If I cross this line, if my hand touches your skin with intent, the non-aggression pact is dead. I will be declaring war on your father, on the Ferraras, and on the very laws that keep this city from drowning in blood." "The laws are already drowning me," I countered, taking a small, defiant step forward until the lace of my bodice brushed the crisp white silk of his unbuttoned shirt. "You said you've watched me for 5 years. Then you know I've been dying in that ballroom. I'd rather be at war with you than at peace without you." A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a mix of a growl and a surrender. He moved then, not with the predatory grace of a dawn, but with the desperate hunger of a man who had been starving in plain sight. His hand rose, hesitant for a fraction of a second, before his palm finally met the curve of my cheek. The contact was electric. It was the first breach, a physical tremor that seemed to vibrate through the very marble beneath our feet. His skin was rough and hot, a jarring contrast to the cold wind, and I leaned into the touch, closing my eyes as 5 years of suppressed longing flooded through me. His thumb traced the line of my lower lip, his touch heavy with a possessive heat that made my knees weaken. "There is no going back from this, Aria," he murmured, his face inches from mine, his breath a warm ghost against my skin. "If I take you, I don't just take your hand. I take your life, your enemies, and your future. I will burn every bridge behind us just to make sure you never have to walk back to them." "Burn them," I breathed, reaching up to wrap my fingers around his wrist, anchoring him to me. He didn't hesitate again. His hand slid from my cheek to the nape of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair as he pulled me upward. When his lips finally met mine, it wasn't a gentle greeting, it was a reclamation. It was the taste of obsidian and sandalwood, of ancient oaths broken and a new, more dangerous promise made in the dark. In that kiss, the treaty wasn't just violated, it was incinerated. The cold night air on the balcony had promised a new beginning, but the suffocating warmth of the ballroom felt like a trap closing in the moment I stepped back inside. Jae-Min's jacket was gone, returned to him in a silent, lingering handoff that felt like losing a layer of skin, yet the phantom weight of his touch remained branded into my soul. I moved through the crowd toward my father's private study, my lips still tingling from a kiss that had effectively declared war on the world I knew. I expected to find him celebrating the Ferrara merger. Instead, I found the door ajar and the sound of a voice that made my blood turn to ice. "The girl is the tether," my father's voice drifted through the crack, stripped of its public joviality and replaced with a sharp, predatory edge. "Jae-Min has been disciplined for 5 years, but tonight he broke. I saw it in the corridor. I saw it on the balcony." I froze, my hand hovering over the handle. I should have turned away, but the mention of Jae-Min's name anchored me to the floor. "If he moves for her, we have the justification to void the Rossi holdings." another voice replied, one of my father's high-ranking lieutenants. The non-aggression pact is a legal shield until he violates the untouchable clause. Once he claims her, we spring the trap at the shipping docks. We don't just get the Ferrara alliance, we get the Rossi empire. And if Aria gets caught in the crossfire? The lieutenant asked. There was a pause, the sound of a match striking, and the scent of my father's heavy cigars wafted into the hall. Aria is a veil. She knows her purpose. If she facilitates the fall of Kang Jae-Min, she has served the family. Whatever happens to her afterward is a secondary concern. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Every word was a jagged blade, cutting through the remnants of the daughterly loyalty I had tried so hard to preserve. I wasn't a bride to be auctioned. I was the bait in a lethal snare designed to destroy the only man who had ever truly seen me. My father wasn't just marrying me off to Luca. He was using my heartbeat to lure Jae-Min into a killing zone. A sudden shadow fell over me, and I turned to find Jae-Min standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable to anyone else. But to me, it was a storm of dark concern. He had followed me, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, his protective instinct overriding the caution he had practiced for half a decade. He saw the way my hands shook, the way the mask of glass was finally, irrevocably shattered. I looked at him, at the man who had admitted to watching me for 1,800 days, who had risked his empire just to touch my cheek, and then I looked at the closed door where my own blood was plotting his execution. The choice wasn't about shipping routes or treaties anymore. It was about whether I would remain a pawn in a game of betrayal or become the woman who burned the board to the ground. I stepped toward him, my fingers trembling as I reached out to grab the silk of his shirt, pulling him into the shadow of a nearby alcove. The fear in my chest was being swallowed by a cold, sharp resolve. "They know," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "They know you broke the pact and they're waiting for you at the docks. My father. He never wanted a merger, Jae-Min. He wanted a massacre." Jae-Min didn't flinch. He simply looked down at me, his eyes darkening with a lethal focus that made my heart skip. "I knew the price when I touched you, Aria. I knew they would try to use you to get to me." "Then why did you do it?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Because I would rather walk into a trap with you than live another day in the safety of your absence," he murmured, his hand coming up to cup the back of my neck, grounding me. "Now, tell me everything. If your father wants a war, we'll give him one. But this time, you're choosing the side." The longing to be safe was gone, replaced by a fierce, dangerous hunger to protect the monster who loved me. I wasn't just choosing a man, I was choosing a rebellion. The golden light of the ballroom now felt like a spotlight on a gallows. I stood beside Jae-Min in the alcove, the air between us thick with the scent of his sandalwood and the cold realization of my father's betrayal. Every second we lingered was a heartbeat closer to the trap at the docks, yet I couldn't move. The weight of his hand on my neck was the only thing keeping the world from spinning into a void of static. "We have to move," I whispered, my voice caught between a plea and a command. "If they see us like this, the massacre starts here, not at the docks." Jae-Min's thumb traced the line of my jaw, a slow, deliberate movement that defied the urgency of the moment. "Let them look," he murmured, his voice a low vibration of lethal intent. "I am tired of the shadows, Aria. 5 years was long enough to play by their rules." Before I could protest, the heavy velvet curtain of our alcove was ripped aside. Luca Ferrara stood there, his face flushed with a mixture of Scotch-fueled rage and the panicked realization that his prize was slipping away. Behind him, my father's security detail began to close in, their hands hovering near the holsters hidden beneath their silk blazers. "Get away from her, Rossi," Luca hissed, his voice cracking with the strain of his fatting ego. "The pact says you don't touch. It says she's untouchable." Jae-Min didn't flinch. Instead, he did the unthinkable. He stepped out of the shadows, his hand sliding from my neck to wrap firmly around my waist, pulling me flush against his side in front of the entire western wing of the ballroom. It wasn't a hidden touch anymore. It was a flag planted in enemy territory. "The pact is dead," Jae-Min announced, his voice carrying with a resonant power that silenced the string quartet 30 feet away. "She was never untouchable, Ferrara. She was simply waiting for a man who knew her worth, And that man isn't you." I felt the gasp ripple through the crowd like a physical wave. My father appeared at the edge of the circle, his face a mask of calculated fury as he realized his trap was being sprung prematurely. "You're signing your death warrant, Kang," my father said, the cigar smoke curling around his head like a shroud. "You violate the treaty, you lose everything. The Rossi name, the shipping routes, your life." Jae-Min looked at my father, then down at me, his eyes softening for a fraction of a second into something so profoundly tender it hurt to see. Then, the coldness returned, a sharp obsidian focus. He reached out with his free hand, unbuttoning the top button of his shirt in a gesture of absolute, unbothered defiance. "I would lose it all 1,000 times over just to stand here with her," Jae-Min replied, his voice a promise of the war to come. Luca lunged forward, driven by a desperate need to reclaim his property. But Jae-Min moved with a terrifying, predatory efficiency. Without letting go of my waist, he caught Luca's throat in a single, crushing grip, lifting the younger man nearly off the floor. The romantic tension that had simmered for 5 years had finally boiled over into a declaration of absolute ownership. "The next person who touches her dies," Jae-Min stated, his gaze sweeping over my father and his men. I looked at my father, seeing the monster for the first time, and then I leaned into Jae-Min. The safety of the glass princess was gone. I was a traitor now, a soldier in a war of two, and as Jae-Min began to lead me toward the exit through a phalanx of enemies, I realized I had never felt more alive. The roar of the gala was replaced by the low, predatory hum of Jae-Min's armored sedan as we tore through the rain-slicked streets of Seoul. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of ozone, and the sandalwood that still clung to the obsidian jacket draped over my lap. Jae-Min sat beside me, his silhouette a jagged line of iron against the blurred neon lights outside. He hadn't let go of my hand since we breached the ballroom doors, his grip a silent tether in a world that had just gone up in flames. I looked down at his suit jacket, the heavy wool feeling less like a garment and more like a brand. For 5 years, the protected status had been an invisible wall, a treaty that kept me safe but kept me starving. Now, that wall was rubble. By wearing his clothes, by accepting his touch in front of the families, I had traded the sterile safety of my father's cage for a life on the run with the city's most dangerous man. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was no longer a veil to be auctioned. I was a Rossi to be hunted. "You're thinking about the choice," Jae-Min said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass my ears and settle straight in my chest. He didn't turn to look at me, but I could feel the weight of his attention, a gravitational pull I no longer wanted to resist. "I'm thinking about the price," I whispered, my fingers tracing the silver buttons of the jacket. "My father will never stop. To him, this isn't just about a broken pact, it's a theft of his property." Jae-Min finally turned his head. The interior light of the car caught the dark intensity in his eyes, the same gaze that had watched me from the shadows for 1,800 days. "You were never his to own, Aria, and you aren't mine to keep like a trophy, but you are claimed. By me. By the 5 years I spent waiting for the courage to burn the world down for you." The romantic tension in the small space was suffocating, a mixture of raw longing and the jagged edge of the danger we had just invited in. He reached over, his large hand cupping the back of my neck, drawing me toward him until our foreheads rested against each other. It was a gesture of profound intimacy and terrifying possession. "The danger is real," he murmured against my lips, his breath warm and steady despite the war we had just started. "But my father's safety was a slow death. You have to decide right now if you can live in the fire with me, because once we reach the safe house, the Veil name won't protect you anymore. Only I will." I looked at the man who had traded his empire for a single night of truth. I thought of the glass princess. I used to be numb, silent, and invisible. The fear was there, a cold knot in my stomach, but the longing for the man caging me in with his heat was stronger. I realized then that I didn't want the safety of a shroud. I wanted the life that came with the obsidian weight on my shoulders. "I've spent enough time being protected," I said, my voice finding a steel it had never known. "I'd rather be claimed by a monster who sees me than a father who doesn't." Yi-Min's grip tightened, his eyes flashing with a predatory triumph that made my heart hammer. He didn't speak. He simply leaned in and claimed my mouth in a kiss that tasted of rebellion and the dark promise of the war to come. The safe house was a brutalist sanctuary of concrete and glass perched high above the Han River, a fortress that felt more like a cage the longer we waited for the inevitable strike. Outside, the city was a blur of hostile neon, but inside, the only light came from the dim amber glow of the fireplace, casting long, dancing shadows across Yi-Min's weary face. He had shed his ruined shirt, his back a map of scars and tension as he cleaned his weapon with a rhythmic, lethal focus. The obsidian jacket lay discarded on the leather sofa, but the scent of him, the sandalwood and the storm, still filled the room, making it impossible for me to breathe. I watched him from the shadows of the kitchen island, my hands gripping a glass of water I couldn't swallow. The silence between us was no longer the formal distance of a treaty. It was a heavy, vibrating thing, charged with the ghost of the kiss we had shared in the car. Every time he looked up, his dark eyes seemed to strip away the last of my defenses, searching for the glass princess I had finally left behind in the ballroom. "You're too quiet, Aria," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He set the gun down and stood, crossing the space between us with that predatory grace that always made my pulse erratic. "If you're regretting the choice, tell me now, before the dawn comes and the hunt truly begins." I looked at him, really looked at him, without the mask of daughterly duty or the shield of my father's name. I saw the man who had starved himself of my presence for 5 years to keep a promise I never asked for. The fear was still there, a cold pulse in my veins, but it was being incinerated by a truth I had been too terrified to name. "I'm not regretting the choice," I whispered, stepping out of the shadows until I was inches from him. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the heated skin of his chest, right over his heart. It was beating as fast as mine. "I'm regretting the time I wasted pretending I didn't see you too." Yi-Min froze, his breath hitching as he looked down at me. "Aria." "You said you watched me for 5 years," I interrupted, the words tumbling out in a rush of desperate honesty. "But I saw you in every room I ever tried to hide in. I looked for your shadow at every gala, every dinner, every funeral. I hated you for staying away, and I hated myself for wanting the one man who was supposed to be my protector. I wasn't just being protected, Yi-Min. I was waiting." The confession was the most dangerous word I had ever spoken, a surrender more absolute than any treaty. It ended the pretending phase, shattering the final barrier between the Rossi Dawn and the Vale daughter. Yi-Min didn't wait for another word. He groaned, a sound of pure, unadulterated longing, and pulled me into him, his hands tangling in my hair as his mouth crashed against mine. It wasn't the tentative kiss of the car. It was a desperate, hungry reclamation. We were 2 stars collapsing into each other, creating a heat that could melt the very concrete around us. In the middle of a war, surrounded by enemies who wanted us dead, I finally found the only place I ever wanted to be. The morning sun broke over the Han River like a spill of molten gold, but the light brought no peace, only the finality of the war we had invited. Inside the safe house, the air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and the lingering, electric heat of our shared confession. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the black sedans of the Vale and Ferrara syndicates weave through the streets below like a funeral procession. I was no longer wearing the obsidian jacket. I had traded it for a suit of my own, a sharp, white silk armor that felt like a shedding of my former skin. Yi-Min stepped up behind me, his presence a grounding force that stilled the frantic rhythm of my heart. He didn't offer empty platitudes or promises of safety. He simply rested his hand on the small of my back, his touch a silent pact of equality. For 5 years, we had been pawns moved by the cold hands of our fathers, but as the elevator hummed with the arrival of our enemies, I felt the final shift from victim to architect. "They're here," I whispered, my gaze fixed on my father's car. "Let them come," Yi-Min replied, his voice a low, sovereign rumble that carried no trace of the hesitation he had felt when he first saw me in that corridor. "Today, we don't ask for permission to exist. We dictate the terms." The doors to the sanctuary opened, and my father marched in, flanked by a bloodless Luca Ferrara and a dozen men with drawn weapons. The air in the room instantly curdled with the scent of my father's heavy cigars and Luca's desperate, fatting ego. My father looked at me, searching for the glass princess who would break under his glare, but he found only a woman who had walked through the fire and liked the heat. "Aria, get away from him," my father commanded, his voice a jagged blade of authority. "The Rossi Empire is finished. The docks are surrounded. You are a Vale and you will fulfill your duty." I took a step forward, not away from Jae-Min, but toward the man who had tried to use my life as bait. I felt Jae-Min's hand drop from my back, not out of retreat, but to give me the space to claim my own voice. "I am not a Vale, and I am not a Ferrara," I said, my voice ringing out with a steel that silenced the room. "I am the woman who knows every secret of the shipping routes you tried to steal. I am the woman who has seen the traitor in your own ranks. And I am the woman who chose the monster you're so afraid of." Beside me, Jae-Min crossed his arms, his dark eyes tracking every movement of the gunmen with a predatory focus. "The docks are empty, Giovanni," he added, his tone almost conversational. "My men moved the cargo hours ago. While you were busy planning a massacre, Aria was busy planning a revolution." The realization hit my father like a physical blow, his face turning a mottled purple. Luca lunged forward, a final, pathetic attempt to assert dominance, but Jae-Min moved with a terrifying efficiency, putting himself between us with a single, warning look that stopped Luca in his tracks. The romantic tension that had once been a secret, suffocating thing was now our greatest weapon, a unified front that the old world couldn't penetrate. We weren't just two lovers standing against the dark, we were the new order. I reached back, my fingers finding Jae-Min's, and for the first time in 1800 days, the silence between us wasn't a cage, it was a throne.